Good morning. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you all for your ongoing support of our live streams, which we're providing free as a public service. If you're enjoying our free webinars and would like to join the effort to keep them going, we have just launched a new platform that makes giving easier than ever before. Please stay tuned at the end of this program to hear details on how you can pledge your support. We have a terrific lineup of live streams through the summer and the fall, and we have special member-only events that enable members to participate directly with the speaker. If that's of interest to you, please go to our website at lawac.org and become a member today. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's program, a conversation with U.S. Senator Tim Scott, moderated by politics professor Dan Schnur. If you are new to our live streams, we will be taking questions in about 20 minutes. There's a panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. Dan, so glad you could moderate today's program. Welcome, Senator Scott, and I turn it over to you, Dan. Enjoy.
Thank you so much, Kim. Thanks to all of you for joining us for this very important one. I know will be a very interesting conversation today. And special thanks to our guest, U.S. Senator Tim Scott. Senator, thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate it.
Good to be with you.
We know that today is an extremely busy day and an extremely busy week in Washington, D.C. So we're eager for your time. I'll ask just a first couple of questions to get things going.
Sure.
And then I think that you'll learn, Senator, something that I learned a long time ago, is that our members are a lot smarter than I am. So the sooner that I stop talking and leave it to them to send their questions into my colleague Jessica DeGanzik, I think that's when the conversation will really accelerate. Where I do want to start, though, is there's no shortage of excellent work you've done since joining the Senate, but I think you'd agree that in terms of visibility and potential impact, the fact that you were tapped by Senate leadership in the immediate aftermath of the tragic death of George Floyd has provided an extraordinary opportunity for our country. And when the Senate leadership asked you to take on a seminal bill on police reform and criminal justice, the nation's attention turned to Washington, D.C. It very quickly looked like that bill was not going to go anywhere, that the two sides were at loggerheads, but you have since been quoted referring to a potential, and I quote, Lazarus moment, quote unquote, and that you and our friend from here in Los Angeles, Representative Karen Bass, have been engaged in some potentially productive conversation. I'm wondering if you could start by telling our audience today a little bit about the status of that bill and what its prospects are for going forward.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. I'll say Karen is a breath of fresh air as it relates to someone who really wants to get to a yes not for ourselves, not for Republicans or for Democrats, frankly, for communities that have been suffering for a very long time. And is there a way to bridge the gap between communities of color and the law enforcement community? I think the answer is yes. She is working on the compromise position of common ground. So I'm excited about how much progress we've made in the last 2 weeks. The real question is, can we get Senate Democrats on board with her and others on her side of the aisle, realizing, as one of the members have said recently, that 2/3 of a loaf is better than none. And so I love that optimism and forward-looking perspective on police reform and, frankly, all issues. If you can find the common ground, why, pray tell, would you not take advantage of that opportunity? And she is doing all that she can to get her team to the front line. And I'm doing the same thing on my side. A little easier for me because I'm already waiting at the yes line to start working on that common ground. There are several pieces of both legislation that are very close. And if we could just bridge the divide between those 6 or 7 pieces, we could literally have 2/3 of what we've been discussing in place before the election, and not use November as a time to campaign on police brutality or police reform, but use August as a time to settle the issue of reform and wait until after the election to see if there's a better opportunity to improve what is 2/3 of a loaf.
Well, I'm going to dig in a little bit further
Sure.
on some of those potential challenges that you talked about. When the bill seemed to slow at the end of last month, it appeared from a distance, at least, that there were three sticking points in particular that were really vexing the negotiations on which you and Representative Bass have been concentrating your attentions. One is the question of gathering data on racial profiling incidents by police in local and municipalities. Number two are the potential protections from lawsuits that police officers should or should not have. And third, interestingly to me, is not a debate about whether or not there should be chokeholds. I don't know anyone who's in favor of them, but rather that and other matters ought to be decided by federal mandate or by the federal government incentivizing the local government.
Yeah.
So on data, on lawsuit, and on mandates versus incentives, I'm wondering if you can tell us how you and Representative Bass are progressing on what seem to be very significant differences.
Yeah, thank you very much. And certainly, I've always found it's most effective when you negotiate with the person in a position to say yes. So I'll certainly save that part for Karen. I'll say this on those three topics, however. On the issue of data collection, the real issue is where is the threshold that begins data collection? I've said serious bodily injury and death are two areas that we know we need to collect data on. So my bill speaks to that, because ultimately what you do with the data is you direct training and resources. What they were talking about is more of racial profiling that happens, and I believe states like South Carolina, we actually already are getting the information on the race of the person that stopped in traffic stops, as well as minor bodily injury. So that information is readily available in South Carolina, and what I've said is, if that is a sticking point, we can bridge that gap pretty quickly. That's not even a hard one. Chokeholds is another classic example. Their bill speaks to it clearly. I think my bill does exactly the same thing from a clarity perspective. Think of it this way: 700,000 of the 800,000 law enforcement officers are not federal officers. Said differently, 100,000 out of 800,000 are. Their bill and my bill both bans chokeholds only for federal officers, because you cannot legislate from the federal government local police decisions and tactics. You can compel behavior by removing the incentive, I'd call that incentive grant dollars. My bill removes the same percentage as the House bill. So even that in and of itself is not a major sticking point. Within the chokehold, there is a definition that we use where the chokehold is the cutting off of air supply. Theirs speaks to the carotid, which is blood flow, as well as air supply. I'm happy to bridge that gap and take their definition of chokeholds, which is an easy thing for us to do, and move forward. So that's not even a hard issue, because we're 99% in the same place, minus the one definition. The important issue is the issue of protecting officers from lawsuits. Here's what I would say to that. The average officer in South Carolina starts their job as a law enforcement officer with a paycheck of around $30,000 a year, 30,000, period, $30,000 a year. Making cops responsible from a civil perspective at a lower threshold, which means more lawsuits, to me doesn't change the culture of law enforcement. If you want to change the culture of law enforcement, you have to follow the dollars. Those dollars do not lead to individual law enforcement officers. It actually leads to departments. And so talking to victims' family members, I've talked to just last week, sisters of two brothers who were killed at the hands of law enforcement. And what they both say is, going after the cop may be something that they want. Going after the cities and the municipalities for restitution and recourse is something that they need to change the culture. We are actually on the same page. they asked me what they could do. I said, well, call your friends and communicate that to them, and they have done so. So that is a place that's part of the qualified immunity conversation. That is a place where I think we could actually make a lot of progress working together to make it more punitive on municipalities and departments to provide recourse and restitution. Impossible to restore life, but restitution from a financial perspective is really important, and that only happens where there is money, and the average law enforcement officer doesn't have a paycheck that would be helpful in providing restitution. They agreed wholeheartedly. So even on that seminal issue, I think we are closer to the finish line than most people even considered, because I'm not sure that people thought that through when they made that their the landmark on that said that we're dividing ourselves in two very different directions.
Let me just ask a follow-up on that if I
Sure.
can, because hearing you talk about it, it does sound like this qualified immunity on lawsuits is the most challenging of those three, of those three hotspots.
I think so.
If someone I care about, a family member or loved one, is, in my opinion, mistreated by the police, and my legal remedy is not the officer, him or herself, but rather the department or the municipality.
Yes.
If a financial penalty is included by a government entity rather than by the individual, would that create the same type of disincentive for an officer as if she were personally financially responsible?
Yeah, Dan, that's a great question. I think you have to look at that from two very different vantage points. The first one is the direct answer to the question. From the family member's perspective who's lost a loved one, the two that I spoke to, both came to the conclusion that a payout from the city or the department changes the entire culture within a department. That means that every single officer will be impacted by that decision, whereas simply having a small settlement from an individual officer doesn't move the needle in the direction of full justice. So that's one approach. The other approach that I think is really important to think it through is that if you are looking to punish all law enforcement officers, that approach probably accomplishes that to include the good officers. Let's play that out for just about 4 or 5 weeks now. What have we seen since we've started putting the target on the back of every officer, no matter whether the behavior is acceptable or unacceptable? What we've seen, Atlanta is a great example of this. There are 6 zones in Atlanta, 3 that are impoverished or low income areas. The response times, the response to 911s, the concerns about putting your own personal assets on the line has caused good officers to rethink, to hesitate in response to some of the challenges in some of the most devastated areas. What does that mean? That there's a chilling effect that actually occurs throughout all of law enforcement when you start targeting the bad apples as the only target, because you actually can't just target the bad apples as the only target. You must put that target on every single back of every single officer, which leads to what we've seen over the last several weeks, a explosion in violent crime in our cities around the country as city councils defund departments, as New York City starts to reduce the amount of funding. We've seen a 79% increase in murders month over 2020 versus 2019, a 64% increase in shootings, a 34% increase in robberies in just that one city. We've seen the kind of chaos and anarchists around the country in places like Portland and then the autonomous zone in Seattle. What happens, unfortunately, when you start demonizing all law enforcement is something that is more than tragic, and frankly, you lose more lives as a consequence of that. So long answer, but the short part of the answer is I think there's a way for us to decertify bad officers, get them off of the forces, and then make sure through the national database established through the president's executive order and our bill that speaks to preservation of records on the local level, we make sure that those officers don't hop from another agency to another agency to another agency. So the recourse is getting rid of them, getting their badge and their gun back, and to provide actual monetary restitution and recourse for the families.
I see. And so therefore the loss of employment and potential future employment is as or perhaps even more onerous a penalty than the financial impact would be.
I think it is, and frankly, it also protects the good officers. Having been born and raised in poverty in a single-parent household, when someone broke into our house, what we needed was a good response time, not a bad one. And so when I look at the actual consequences of some of the policy positions taken with good intentions, it only puts vulnerable communities in a far more vulnerable position. That is too high of a price to pay. But putting those departments in a strong position where they have to re-examine their efforts is a good position. North Charleston, South Carolina, the death of Walter Scott in 2015 is a classic example where a city paid out millions of dollars because the officer A lied, A killed someone, B lied on the incident report, and C, because of a video, we were able to uncover that. The entire culture of the North Charleston Police Department has transformed since those in the last 5 years because the city says we can't do that twice. That is a very different cultural revolution than just one officer fighting for or against their own assets.
Well, and certainly this is a challenge we faced in Los Angeles.
Yes.
For those of us who were here during the unrest that followed Rodney King's trial
Yes.
in the 90s, and some of our members who were even here during the unrest of the 1960s, your point about broader systemic change at the department and the municipal level is an important one. For those of you who've just joined us, we're here with U.S. Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina today, the lead author of the critically important criminal justice and police reform bill that's being discussed in the Senate. For those of you who joined at 11:30 wondering why we're already engrossed in the conversation, is the senator has an extraordinarily busy schedule in Washington today, and it's thanks to his good graces that we were able to start a little bit early rather than losing him altogether in order to have this conversation. Senator, I'm going to ask you one more question.
And Dan, before you ask that question, let me say this, if you don't mind. Thank you for your graciousness and your flexibility. What occurred was the Senate called votes at 2:30, and unfortunately, I can say yay or nay, but I can't say wait. So I had to move things up, and you were very flexible to be helpful on that part. So thank you very much.
Well, like I said, we're excited to have you. And for those of you who did join late, know that you'll receive a link from the crack staff at LA World Affairs Council Town Hall with a YouTube link to this conversation tomorrow. And so if you like, you'll be able to watch our conversation with the senator in its entirety. One last question that I'm going to ask before I end this monopoly over our conversation is, this is obviously, as I mentioned earlier, an extremely busy week in Washington. And in addition to this critically important police reform bill, of course, we are coming up on a deadline in a little bit more than 72 hours on the latest COVID-19 relief package. So, Senator, the last question I'll ask you before we bring in our audience members is, does the import of the COVID-19 legislation does it interfere with your and Representative Bass's ability to get the police reform bill done? Congress gets criticized often for only being able to do one thing at a time. Is there time between now and Friday night to do both?
We've earned that criticism. So it's amazing that we can't chew gum and walk at the same time. But I think this is one of the rare occasions where if we have the will, and I certainly do, and I think Karen does as well, to get something done, there is a way. It would take consent and a cooperation on both sides of the aisle. The good news is that we are in next week as well. I know the House is flirting, so to speak, with leaving on Saturday for an extended period of time. I hope that if it's necessary for them to stick around next week to tackle this issue of police reform, that they're willing to do so, because as you said at the beginning, the Lazarus effect, we only have about 3 days before it expires. So I'm hoping that we actually get to it before we hit the end.
So in fact, this might end up expanding the window of opportunity given the import of the COVID.
It's possible, yes, sir. The real challenge, to be frank with you, is after Labor Day. If we're gone for most of August, after Labor Day, it's all politics. I mean, right now it's about 90% politics, but after Labor Day, it's what's best for presidential candidates in November. And frankly, the reason why we're still here having the conversation is because presidential politics has seeped into the Senate in a way that it has not seeped into the House. And Karen has been very clear and frankly, very persistent about getting something done. Forget the political outcome, but do the right thing for the communities today. And I gotta say, I admire that approach to this really important legislation.
Well, we are rooting for both you and Representative Bass, but I'll warn you, Senator, if you keep saying nice things about her, people are going to assume that you are endorsing her for vice president.
That's a good point. I better slow my roll, so to speak, because she doesn't want my endorsement for that job, because ultimately Joe Biden will take her out the running. So we'll stop on that. Thank you very much.
Well, we'll leave the vice presidential talk for another day.
Okay.
Jessica, the floor is yours. I know we've got a large number of audience questions, so by all means, we should get to them with our remaining time.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Senator Scott. Just give me a heads up when you need to go, but we'll get through as many of these questions as we can. The first one, how can you help lead a national conversation on how to rethink the use of police in dealing with society's problems and how to focus on root causes?
Thank you, Jessica. I'd say one of the things that I can do to help lead that conversation is things I've already started doing. When I sat down with the president and I guess it's 12 family members who had lost their loved one to interaction or a collision with the police. One of the things we talked about, and this is a painful story by a father who talked about his son in the middle of a mental health episode, lost his life. Police officer shot him because the officer, in some ways, just was not equipped for a mental health episode. And so one of the things that we talked about is a part of my bill from a research perspective, as a part of the executive order, is co-responders to scenes. I think my friends on the other side of the aisle would welcome that conversation, to be frank, where we have mental health experts responding to certain scenes so as to de-escalate the situation on the scene, so that both the officer and the suspect get to go either home or where they need to go without bodily harm. That is something that we need for mental health issues, for addiction issues, homelessness. There is a way for us to resource the outcomes we want through grant resources, and I'm hopeful that we can get there.
Thank you.
Yes,
do you have any suggestions for de-escalating the ongoing confrontations between protesters and federal law enforcement authorities in Portland and other cities?
Well, first, I think we have to bifurcate the conversation. The folks in Portland, some of the folks in Seattle and the autonomous zone, those folks are not connected to the George Floyd or the racial challenges of the past. They have morphed or evolved into something that is more chaotic and more anarchist in nature. And so that's a very dangerous, potent situation. The only way to diffuse that is to limit the amount of territory that they're able to cover as quickly as possible. I know that in Portland, the federal officers have come in to protect federal buildings, which of course, they're basically the best response to that. But the Portland mayor has been at a couple of the rallies talking with folks from the BLM and other communities. There is a organized apparatus that is embedded in these protests that have really nothing, as I said, to do with the actual outcome of racial equality or justice. It is a very different group that seems to be sparking these conflicts, and that has to be met with a different type of response than the non-violent protesters seeking for justice and for really a transformation in our nation that in areas is still necessary. You're not getting there through what you're seeing in Portland or what you saw in Seattle.
Thank you. In the event of a Biden presidential win, how do you anticipate the process going forward regarding addressing police reform?
I'm still shocked at the Biden win, so I apologize for the delay there. It was not me. It was my screen wasn't frozen. I just was. So I think what happens if there's a Biden victory is that they go harder after individual officers as well as after the Section 242, which is a criminal prosecution of more officers. I think that means that this entire thing goes off the rails in a terrible way. And you can overreach in this area. And what we have to do is make sure that no matter who's in the White House, and obviously I do not prefer um, Biden, but I will say that holding on to the control of the Senate, if Biden's the president, is probably more to my liking as a result of that change, if that actually were to occur. So I think it does matter who's in charge of the Senate. If we are able to hold on to the Senate, I think you have a more measured approach to police reform than if you have Biden having the Senate, the White House, and the Congress. That takes a turn for the worse from my perspective.
Got it. And next question, why did Senator McConnell hold up the COVID relief bill in the Senate until now when the House bill passed weeks ago?
It's a great question. I don't have an answer for you. I would just say that the House went first on this bill in a very similar fashion that they went first on the police reform legislation, and we followed. So most economic issues, for whatever reason, besides the Constitution, typically starts in the House and works its way across the aisle. We could have gone first. I'm not suggesting that the Constitution would have prevented us to do so as it does from a financial perspective. I think this is a bit of a morphing of issues. I think the House just went first and then we went afterwards. I think the truth is that we were wanting to see how $6 trillion, 2.8 in direct resources, another $3.5 trillion in indirect resources through the commercial facilities and the 13(3) facilities from the banking and the Treasury areas. We wanted to see how that plays out in America. We still have not taken enough time to understand it all. We've had enough time to figure out that there are some things that we need to do, i.e. the end of the enhanced unemployment, trying to bridge that gap. That should be an easy one for us to do if there is the will to do so. But the very essence of the legislation goes beyond unemployment benefits. It goes into how we will respond as a nation to this crisis. The only way for us to figure that out is to see how 2 or 3 tranches of our response has impacted the economy. We don't have that answer yet, but we have been looking for it. So I think the time is now for us to do something. So that's my short answer to a very layered question. I think that may have to be my last question.
Okay, can I get one more in just in case?
How long do I have? Hold on a second. Okay. She says I have 90 seconds. Okay.
Okay, great. This is a big question.
I'll try to do 2 of them. I'll try to do them very quickly.
All right. What should the Republican platform state to attract Black Americans back to the GOP? Is it too late to attract them back?
Actually, I was looking at the polls around minority voters, and frankly, the president's doing far better than most people think he is with minority voters. Last time around, I think he ended up with about 8% of African American votes. I think right now he's on target to do a little bit better than that, believe it or not, because his policy positions have been strong, powerful, and undeniable, whether it's record-breaking support for historically Black colleges and universities, whether it's opportunity zones that I championed, that he supported, helping work on sickle cell anemia, the pre-pandemic unemployment rates, the increase in African American home ownership. There are just a litany of issues where we have done well. If we want to go even further, then I would say that our rhetoric needs to be consistent with our politics or our policies. And to the extent that we move in that direction, I think you find us in a healthier position to attract minorities. And finally, I would say go where you're not invited. I'm not invited everywhere. Even though I'm an African American, happen to be a Republican, so some areas of the community do not invite me to their events. I just show up anyways to say, hi, I'm here, and we end up having a really good conversation. So
that's great. Well, this has been a great conversation too. So thank you so much for your time. I don't want to keep you, and if you have to go, I don't want to keep Molly from.
Molly's telling me to wrap it up. So thank you very much, Jessica.
Okay.
Dan, sir, thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to your audience. God bless. Have a great day.
Thank you, Senator Scott.
Very much appreciate your time.
We'll close it down.
Jessica, I think you'd agree that, obviously LA World Affairs Council Town Hall is a nonpartisan organization. And so that's why we work so hard to bring in guests from across the political spectrum. I'm sure a lot of our audience today was with us when we talked to Representative Adam Schiff a few weeks ago. And a couple of quick shameless plugs. We already have Secretary of State Alex Padilla and Representative Kevin McCarthy scheduled in the weeks ahead, in addition to our regular programming.
Yeah.
I feel bad that we didn't have more time with Senator Scott, but interesting conversation, didn't you think?
I think it was very interesting to hear his perspective, and any opportunity that we have to hear from a senator, it's always very welcome. We've hosted Senator Feinstein before, Senator McCain in the past. So, they're doing important work, and I'm glad when we get any time we can with them. So I was glad he could join us today.
Great, and we're glad that all of you were able to join us. I apologize for hogging so much time. I had about 20 or 25 more follow-up questions on the crime bill itself. But Jessica, I thought you did a great job of getting as many of our audience questions in as possible. So Kim, we did our best on a short clock.
You both did a terrific job, and we'll have to bring it back as more time. Thank you for a great conversation, Dan, as always. And next Thursday, you didn't plug your own Politics in the Time of Coronavirus, the weekly special program that Dan does. So I can't wait.
Thursday, 11 a.m. Pacific, we'll be talking about the COVID bill that Senator Scott referred to and whether partisanship is more powerful than the pandemic. We'll also be talking, Kim, about the increasing the widespread conversation that's taking place among school parents in California and elsewhere, the question of so-called education pods and both the advantages to parents and to children of providing more exclusive education opportunities for school kids who aren't able to attend public schools under the current circumstances. On one hand, the advantage that provides for the kids themselves. On the other hand, it raises questions about educational inequity for children and families who aren't able to provide those additional resources. That plus the morning headlines. So hopefully we'll have a good conversation on Thursday at 11.
It will be terrific as always. And if you all, as our viewers, enjoyed this program, here's how you can pledge your support for us. Simply type the word GIVE, G-I-V-E, to the number on the screen below. Just type in GIVE and help us continue these wonderful live streams and Dan's fabulous weekly programs. And as Dan said, we have a terrific lineup of programs coming up on August 4th. We have business ethics, new rules of engagement. This is Rob Chestnut, who's the Chief Ethics Officer at Airbnb. On August 11th, we have Creating the World You Want to Live In, featuring the president of LMU University and some key faculty experts who are going to be discussing the future of higher education. August 19th, as Dan said, we have a conversation with House Republican leader, Congressman Kevin McCarthy. So please go to our website, lawac.org, and sign up today register for those wonderful programs. Please stay safe, stay informed, and we'll see you Thursday for Dan's weekly program. Take care, everybody. Thanks, Dan.
Have a great day, everybody.